I really, really dislike having to have hard conversations. Conflict is not my thing. Anybody else agree with that statement? Okay, and if you don't, if you like conflict, we have another Elevate session for you coming up in the days ahead, I think. But the truth is, this was a pivotal moment in my adult life. And as I've looked back over the years, as I've gathered more experience in my life, I recognize now how dangerous and detrimental it is when we avoid conflict or when we approach it and engage it in poor ways. That's why we're here this morning. That's the conversation that we want to have, because I've come to believe that it's our ability to engage and navigate hard conversations that lies at the core of our ability to have deep, meaningful relationships with other people. And I think it's core to our ability to have a strong witness as a follower of Jesus Christ. Think about that for a minute. Jesus, his entire ministry, his life here on earth, was fraught with conflict and hard conversations, was it not? I've been reading recently in my devotional reading, again through the Gospel of Matthew. I started again on January 1st. And so this week I decided I was going to go all the way back to the beginning, and I was going to read the whole Gospel, but all through the lens of conflict. Look for every instance where Jesus had a hard conversation. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I just want to give you an overview. Matthew starts with the birth narrative. We just read through it a lot during Christmas season. But Matthew tells us that Jesus entered a world in conflict. Did he not? And then we go right from the get-go. He's not shying away. He's taking on human flesh, and he's coming into our world fraught with conflict. But then we go a little further into Matthew's gospel, and we get this first real conversation that Jesus has, according to Matthew, and it's with John the Baptist. And he goes to John and says, "Baptize me." And John says, "Oh, I shouldn't baptize you. You should be baptizing me." I'm guessing that was a little awkward. Go a little further, chapter 4, Jesus is confronted by Satan in the wilderness. It's not a hard conversation, I'm sure. In that same chapter, Jesus confronts the entire nation of Israel. The entire nation. He says, "Repent of your sins and turn to God." No sugarcoating. He just goes right at it. He's not worried about being potentially offensive or politically correct. He gets to the heart of the matter and engages the hard conversation. And this was pretty much Jesus's modus operandi. He tells fishermen and tax collectors to drop everything and to follow him. And let's be honest, if somebody came in today and did that to us, we just avoid making eye contact with them and hope they buzz by us, right? He addressed thousands in the Sermon on the Mount, and in that sermon, think about all of the subjects he tackled: anger, adultery, divorce, revenge, enemies, money, possessions, judgment of others, on and on and on. And aren't these the kind of conversations we love having? Not so much. But even beyond these obvious examples of conflict engagement, these examples of hard conversations that Matthew accounts for us in recalling Jesus' life, I often think about Jesus choosing the 12 disciples and what conflict that must have been wrapped in, right? Because to choose one person is to not choose someone else, to offend someone else or make someone else feel less than. Jesus confronted Pharisees time and time again as they snickered and sneered and judged him for teaching and healing on the Sabbath. And very explicitly, Matthew reminds us that Jesus said that we should not shy away from conflict, that we should not be afraid of those who oppose us. And so it occurred to me this week as I read the Gospel of Matthew again with this lens, that while I love peace, and while my life mantra could be, "Can't we all just get along?" Jesus' example clues me into the fact that not only is conflict inevitable in our earthly journeys, but also that it's not inherently bad. That depending on how we engage conflict, God can use those interactions in significant kingdom-building ways. And I think this really gets at the heart of the matter, because I think so often we have a perception of conflict that just naturally associates it with evil or bad or difficulty. But conflict in itself doesn't have to be a negative thing. And so we start there sort of with our construct of conflict. But even if you have gotten to the place where, you're seasoned enough in life or you've had enough experience that you would agree with that and say, yeah, I learned that a long time ago. What we're finding is in our world that is more communicated with and communicative than ever before in the history of civilization, we're increasingly bad at how we engage conflict. You don't need me to tell you what you see on social media every day. We post and tweet things that we would never say to another human being if they were standing in front of us, that we would never even get up in front of people and say, most likely. Some of you would, but mostly, we see a lot of that passive aggressiveness come out through that communication medium. And so this morning, I want us to spend a majority of our time together identifying first, what do we perceive as a hard conversation? And then discussing some important concepts and strategies about how we can healthily engage those difficult conversations, okay? This is what I want you to do. We're gonna start with a little discussion at our tables. Select one recorder. You can use the paper, there's pens at your table. And I want you to have a quick discussion. I'm just gonna give you 3 to 4 minutes. No specifics, please, okay? No names, no specific scenarios. But I want you to make a list of what you think about when you think of a hard conversation or an interaction that is just immediately conflict oriented. Does that make sense? So generic concepts, try to come up as many as you can. I'm gonna give you 3 minutes, all right? Talk amongst yourselves. Let's take about 1 more minute. All right, help me out. Let's make a list here. What are some of the hard conversations that your table identified? Shout them out. Oh, yes. So much so that I didn't want to have a talk about that. What else? Family. For some of us, that's all you got to say. Yeah, what else? Authority. Power conversations. What else? Good. Work. Religion. What was that? Wrongdoing. Okay. Gender. Language. Oh, yeah. Change and transition. Oh, yeah. You got to call somebody out on something? Ugh. What else? Okay, yeah. Parenting. We got a lot of on that one. Oh, the future. Especially when just the right person's asking you, right? Anything else? Oh, yes. I don't know why you'd know about that. What else? Any others? Yeah. Okay. Work, stress, education. Man, pretty much we've covered all of our lives. I feel like. These are great examples. I didn't have you pre-talk about this, so we'll just do this unscripted. But the other side of the board here, I want to put down, what are the feelings that these conversations evoke in you? Again, don't be detailed, just general emotions and feelings. Yeah. Say it again. Yes? What does that evoke in you? What kind of feeling? Okay. Bad thoughts. What else? Yes, it's a real deal. Dread, of course. What else? Anger. Confusion, good one. Awkward. Agitation. You guys are my spelling skills. What else? Defensiveness. Oh, yeah. Oh, amen. My former boss, my last job, used to die laughing because we get in meetings and I just start going. Because it's real. It's real. What else? Denial. Huge. Passion. I'm not even spelling that one. Let's make a sad face. Yeah. Selfishness. Yes. You guys are getting ahead of the lesson here. It's good. What? One more? Disappointment or? That's good. Okay, we're out of space, so we're going to move on. These are good. Man, what an awful list. What a great awful list, huh? Well, part of this is, of course, how we define what a hard conversation is. And we could go around the room and probably for as many people as are in this room, we could come up with that many definitions. So I decided to use one that I found that I really like. This is an educator and author whose name is Jennifer Abrams. And she said, except I don't think this is working. What do I have to do different, Chip? Oh no, I'm just pushing the button. Should I turn off and back on? Well, it was on, but now it's dead. Huh? It broke, it froze. Okay, well, I'll tell you the definition and then you can see it later. She said that a hard conversation is any time you feel uncomfortable, have second thoughts, or try to avoid saying what needs to be said. It's pretty good, isn't it? Anytime you feel uncomfortable, have second thoughts, or try to avoid saying what needs to be said. This definition caught my attention because it's open-ended. Because I think that depending on your personality type and your God-given dispositions, your background, your upbringing, all of these experiences you've had in life, what you would perceive as a hard conversation or as conflict is going to be different from somebody else's. I'll give you an example. Those of you who are more outgoing, more assertive, aggressive type, you might define conflict as two people having opposing viewpoints arguing, or two people in a knockdown, drag-out fight even. I mean, we're talking an extreme definition. But for some of you who are more introverted, low-key personality types, you might perceive conflict to be going into a place of business and saying, "Hi, I'm Emily. Are you hiring?" And being told no. Now that's going to sound crazy to some of you. That's going to sound downright crazy. But the reality is, in that moment for the person who went in and asked, are you hiring? It's not just that they were told no. They're actually processing the conflict is that what's your name? I put Andrea in the situation of having to disappoint me. And there's conflict in that. So our personalities play a huge role in our conception of what conflict is in the first place and what a hard conversation is. I talk to people sometimes and they tell me things like that. This is literally an example I had with somebody who I was like, "Oh my goodness, this is a hard conversation for you." And while I can feel like, really? Like they just tell you no and you say, "Thanks so much, have a good day." But if I put myself in their shoes, and especially if I go back a few years in my life, I have to admit, this is exactly where I would have been too. I don't want to make that other person tell me the hard news. And I don't want to receive a bad answer either, right? I mean, I want a yes. So understanding what our perception of a hard conversation or conflict is in the first place is extremely important. And so this comes into play for me in two ways. One, I have to understand my own perception of conflict, and then I need to understand the other side's perception of conflict, all right? Because I may have just entered into a hard conversation and I don't even realize it. Because to me, it's easy. But to the person across the table, we have just engaged in a hard conversation. So what I want to do this morning, and let's see, can some of you guys here help me pass these out? I'm going to have you take a quick conflict management assessment. This is not the one I took. This is not my professor's work, all right? This is very short. It should take you no more than 5 minutes. So I'll have some of you pass these out if you don't mind doing that. Just everybody needs one. Hopefully we'll have enough there. It's very short series of questions. They're pretty straightforward. Can I encourage you? No one necessarily is going to see this but you. And so I want to encourage you to be fully honest with yourself as you answer these questions, all right? Because remember, in order to grow yourself, you have to know yourself, all right? So be honest and take a few minutes, fill this out, and then when you're done, I'm going to make you wait to understand what it means, okay? So just a heads up. Are we getting pretty close? Okay, I promise you will have a score on this before you leave today, but I want to make you wait for a few minutes, all right? Because I want you to understand the key concepts before we dive into what this means, because you'll lock in on, "Oh, this is me," and then we won't learn anything else, all right? So I often say that I know I've worked for Steve Deneff for too long when everything is either a circle or an XY axis, but I'm going to look at this as an XY axis, okay? So when we think about conflict management, there's two ways I want you to imagine all of this, all right? Number one, and I know this is really small, so I'm going to tell you, is the x-axis we're going to say is we have a high aggression or high assertion attitude towards conflict, or we have a low aggression, low assertion, all right? And then on the y-axis, oh, what did I do? I think I did something else, Chip. There we go. All right. The y is either we have high cooperation and consideration or low, all right? So just keep those things in mind. Another way you can think about it is a concern for self and concern for others. These are the factors in the primary management styles of conflict, all right? So we're going to look at 5 dominant styles of conflict management. The first one is competition. Now, I don't know about all you. When I was young, I was highly competitive, which is curious to me because I kind of hate competition now. I think I figured out that my upbringing had something to do with this. I grew up with a brother and 3 male cousins that I was very close with. Everything was a competition. Everything. And so I learned that was a mode of survival, all right? So if you're highly competitive, it would be interesting to think through, why is that a part of your makeup? Why is that your dominant approach to conflict? But in competition, the general attitude, and again, I'm very much giving you an overview here, is that you're seeking to win. All right? You're not so much wanting to achieve understanding with the other person, you want to be right. All right? So it's black and white mentality, seeking to win. It usually involves powering up. That could be physically, positionally, working up the chain in your organization so that you can get on top of everybody else and hold power over them. You use some good words here. Usually has a physical posture. I had a funny thing early in my professional career. Someone said to me, we had a meeting that went really bad. And somebody said to me, were you just so intense? And I was like, what? Like, I didn't feel intense about this at all. And they said, do you know that when you speak at a meeting, you tend to lean forward? And I was like, I do? And she's like, yeah, every time you speak up. And so that gives the feeling that you're powering up, you're aggressive and assertive, which is so funny because I was like, oh, I don't really care that much about the topic. I was just trying to participate. But the advice I got was to keep my shoulder blades in the back of my chair. So sometimes you're ever in a conversation with me and it doesn't get intense, you'll see me kind of slink down on my chest. I'm cool. Competition also usually communicates task orientation, and it has little to no concern for the people or the relationships. Because remember, when you're task-oriented and you're competitive in nature, the target is the win. Everything else, get out of the way. And that's a temptation for those of us who are most wired to deal with conflict in a competitive mindset. So there are positives to competition, all right? If you have a competitive mindset, you're usually goal-oriented, and things are going to come to resolution real fast. For one reason or another, you're going to offend somebody. Everybody else is going to be like, no, I'm not going there with you. And they'll be done. So there are positives to this, but of course the negatives are that competition in dealing with conflict can breed hostility, and it can cause others to feel threatened and to shut down. Does anybody want to admit that if someone else comes across as competitive, they just tend to check out? I do. Right? I'm just like, I don't need this, man. This is not my bag. And so I will check out of the conversation and think, well, clearly you care about this way more than I do. And I don't want to fight. So competition definitely is one way that we can deal with conflict as a default mechanism. Where we put this on the XY axis is up here in the left upper quadrant. And that's really has high aggression, but a low consideration. So we're thinking mostly of self, again, win, 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 and not thinking much of others. Task-oriented, everybody else get out of the way. Second form of conflict management is avoidance. Oh man, I'm going to spend a few minutes on this because this is my default mechanism to be sure. So in avoidance, we generally deny there's any problem, right? This is the head in the sand syndrome. If I can just pretend there's not a problem, everything will be fine. This is the child who says, if I can't see you, you can't see me. That's the attitude of avoidance. Usually a person who deflects or defers to avoidance, they're just going to change the topic, right? It starts to get into an escalated subject matter and you're like, hey, how about the Colts? You go a completely different direction. That's probably not a good switch for conflict avoidance this season. But the point is, you find something completely unrelated and you go there in order to get out of it. You'll also refuse to make a decision or make a commitment. So if you're indecisive, that could be an indicator that avoidance is one of your go-tos in dealing with conflict. Because if I make a decision, go back to Jesus and the apostles, if I make a decision, there's the potential of hurting or offending someone else. So when we have the avoidance tendency, this is what we often resort to. And oh man, so guilty of this. We default to humor about the issue of tension. So many times, because avoidance is my natural proclivity, I want to lighten the room. I want to let the air out. And so I'll make a crack or a joke. And maybe once it's okay. It kind of leavens things a little bit. But actually, I've had people come to me and say, this is a really serious issue to me, and I felt like you were poking fun at it. And that wasn't my intent at all. I could maybe even see the value of the conversation. I just didn't like the tension, so I was trying to get out of it. Very common if avoidance is your default mechanism. And then, of course, passive aggressive comments. Yay, those are fun too. But we tend to do those things as well. We don't really want to engage the problem, but if you care about it, it's kind of fun to just get a little jab in there every now and then, or do something that's sort of under the radar that lets people know, yeah, I care about this, but I don't really want to touch it. Sorry, this is where I want to go a little bit further into this one because I know this one so well. The general mindset of a person who defaults to avoidance is that conflict is bad, all right? So that was what my professor pointed out in me. This leads to, you have a lot of anxiety whenever you smell conflict coming from like 50 miles away. You know it's coming and you just get anxiety ridden. You just know it's going to happen. That leads to avoiding the conflict as long as possible, thus the name avoidance, which cycles into what is inevitable. Every conflict will eventually come to a head in some way. You can only avoid it for so long if it's truly a conflict and if it's something that really matters to people. And this, of course, leads to poor handling of the issue, because if it sneaks up on us when we've avoided it and then all of a sudden it's in your face, most likely you're not going to deal with this very well. I give myself an amen. So many times where I've tried to avoid conflict for so long, and then it gets to that place where it just smacks me upside the head, and man, do I wish I could go back and make a plan. If I'd just gone back and addressed it in a more direct manner, it would have gone so much better. But because I put it off and it came up and I had to deal with it, I didn't act well. And unfortunately, this just leads us right back to a further belief that conflict is bad. It's a vicious, vicious cycle. And it will go on and on and on until you confront that issue in yourself and recognize that there is a way, a healthy way to deal with conflict. So, I don't know, it's my own therapy maybe, but if for those of you who are avoiders, that's what happens to you, just so you know. The pros of avoidance, because there are pros, right, is that usually the problem never escalates, at least not in the immediate. It will postpone difficulties. So as a recovering avoider, what I would tell you is that I would get home and think, whew, okay, put that off for another day. Didn't have to deal with that today. Yes. And then I would get in bed and be like, oh no, tomorrow, right? Like it's gonna happen. And so you get yourself into this place that it's miserable because it will happen eventually. Why wouldn't we just attack it? Bad word. That's a very competitive word. Why wouldn't we just approach it in a more productive and intentional manner? The cons, of course, then are the problem is unresolved and unaddressed. And again, I promise you, it will come back and it will bite you at some point when you don't want to and you aren't prepared to deal with it. There's avoidance. So on the XY axis, we put that down in the lower left quadrant, which says I'm not very aggressive and assertive, but I'm also not really thinking of anybody else. Because I fail to recognize that in confronting the issue, in dealing with it, we all move forward together. This is just saying, I don't care about anybody. I don't want to deal with it, period. The third style then is accommodation. Another good one for you peace lovers out there. And when we accommodate, our ultimate goal is to please somebody else. You relational people love to accommodate because for you, the relationship is so much more important than whatever is at stake. But the thing is, we sometimes make that seem like a good thing, like, oh, they're so nice. The problem is, accommodators aren't always cheerful in their approach. They might be on the surface or initially, but accommodating can become a real drag. And eventually it wears on the person, and that begins to come out. Sometimes people use accommodation habitually, and they start to take on the mindset of, I'm a martyr. Like, I'm such a good person, I just let everybody have their way. And, this is not productive in relationship. This is not the attitude and the spirit that we want to have when we relate to other people. But it is the most common approach that people use in the workplace. Typically, and this is a little bit sad, but typically workplaces are not where we find our closest community. And so it's just easier to accommodate and get people off your back than it is to confront something. But the same problems arise in the workplace as they do in the home or in the friendship realm, whatever it is, when we are constantly accommodating and not dealing with the true root issue. Of course, there are pros to accommodation. Accommodation can minimize injury or someone being hurt, offended, you name it. And generally speaking, accommodation seeks again to maintain the relationship. But the truth is, if I am constantly being accommodating in my relationship with Anna, then my relationship with her can only go so far. There's a cap on how far we will ever connect with one another because I'm constantly bending, just saying, well, I just don't want her to be upset with me. But I'm not really going to work too hard to make that relationship go any further, which leads to the cons. Eventually, accommodation can breed resentment, typically in the person who's accommodating. I start to get tired of the fact that I'm constantly bending to Anna's wishes and wants. And it tends to exploit the weak. Weak is sort of a pejorative word there, but what I would say is weak meaning I'm not competitive. I don't want to fight you for it. I'm just going to be like, I don't have the energy for this. So accommodating is very common. We use it a lot. And we would say on the XY axis, it falls in the lower right quadrant. It's got a high consideration of others, but it's very unassertive. It's passive. I haven't been stopping for questions, but anybody have questions at this point? I should probably do that on any of those three. You're like, no, get to it because we want to know what our tendency is. Okay, let's keep going. So compromise, love this one. In compromising, we're moderately cooperative and assertive. Okay, so it's kind of like you think, oh, this is the best of both worlds. I care about other people and I care about myself. Okay, maybe. It can expedite a resolution in a hard situation. Of course, we were taught as children, compromise, right? Find the middle way so that everyone's happy. There are pros to this approach. But it also can be the easy way out, and it doesn't really get us to the heart of the problem. Compromising, again, sort of like accommodating, is one way that we might say, well, I get something out of this that I'm trying to accomplish, but okay, I won't go for broke. And that's not a bad thing in certain situations, but in others, it means we, again, never go that last 10%. We never really deal with the issue that we need to talk about, the true thing that's causing the conflict. And it also can reinforce a power balance between two people, but it can make everybody feel like they're losing if this is always our approach. So if we never go that last 10%, if we never get to the heart of the matter, then you basically can end up with two people or a group of people who always feel like they're in a lose-lose situation. I never really got to what I was hoping to accomplish here. We never really got to true resolution. Oh, and it can be a great tool for truly finding resolution because in compromise, you're working together, but it also can just be a mask for avoidance. And what I found in being an avoider is that when I go the route of compromise, because in my journey, what I will tell you is I went from being a habitual avoider to then I moved to this season of compromise. I thought, well, I'll take a step up. And that's good, but the problem is it really just became even more problematic because the people I was compromising with eventually felt more tense because I was like putting my toe in the water, but I wasn't committing and going into the conversation holistically. That's one of the greatest downsides of compromise. The pros, useful in complex situations where there's no simple solutions and all parties are equal in power. We see this a lot of times organizationally at high levels of management and leadership. It's like, okay, I'm going to fight for my department. You're going to fight for your department. So we've got to find a middle ground. So it can be useful. And in some situations, maybe even absolutely essential. The downside, though, is that usually in compromise, no one's ever truly satisfied. And so we get mediocre solutions. Okay, we can do it. But nobody ever walks away from compromise usually just going, okay, moving forward. This was good. We've gone to that next level. You have to sort of frame this all in, it's different organizationally than it is in your relationship with your mom or your best friend or your brother, okay? It's a little different when we're talking interpersonally, but the concepts pretty much hold together. Compromise, here again, we think, oh, it's right in the center. That's good, right? Well, it's better than some. But we see where compromise even can still leave something on the table. It can still inhibit us in one layer from going and having that deep kind of relationship that we're seeking for. And that leads us to the last style, which is collaboration. Bet you know where that's going on the axis. Okay. Collaboration generally inspires new ideas. It says, okay, if we're not going to compromise, you have ideal A, I have idea B. We don't want to have ideal A, B, so let's imagine idea C. It makes us think outside of the box and realize that there may be other ways to go about resolving the tension. Typically, collaboration says everyone at the table is respected. Your ideas matter, even if they're different than mine. It usually results in buy-in from all parties because, again, Ainsley's not winning with idea A, I'm not winning with idea B, but together we have created idea C. And it values both the relationship and whatever we're trying to accomplish, the task, equally. Both matter. I don't have to be, well, I'm people-oriented, well, I'm task-oriented. No, together we are people and task-oriented. This also is the solution that takes the most work. You can see why, right? You come to the table, you've already conceived of idea A. Let's just do it. But they've come with idea B. And so it's going to take us time to create, listen to one another, and understand another way forward. The pros here are that mutual trust is created and we maintain positive relationships while at the same time our commitment to moving forward grows because we've done this together. We've created it together. I didn't put any cons on collaboration because at least so far I haven't found them, except that it takes time. So sometimes it's hard for us to engage in collaboration when we have time-sensitive issues that we have to deal with. It's usually the biggest inhibitor to engaging this form of conflict resolution, which I did put on there, I just forgot. And it does take a lot of energy. I mean, if you've ever done this, you know it's exhausting. And you have to lay down a lot of your own preferences and the work you've already done in order to let the other person in. And so, of course, that form is high cooperation with the other person, but it also is active engagement. So we think of aggression as a bad thing, but that's why I included the word assertion. It's like, I come to the table ready, willing, and wanting to come up with something new. But I think that helping people understand that conflict is not a bad thing is the beginning point. And then we do, and we'll get to it here, practical considerations for how we do it. I'm going to tell you, the other night I was in a conversation with my husband about this. We were just talking through this, and I don't remember why we got on this, but somewhere in the conversation he said something about, well, so will there be conflict eternally, like in heaven? I was like, oh my gosh, we have to go into the big, deep theological question. But I started thinking about this, right? Because I was like, biblically speaking, I'm not sure that I would think of conflict as something that is in eternity. And yet, if I don't believe it's a bad thing, I don't know. Like, I mean, maybe I'm going to gather around a table with people who have differing opinions than I do to some extent. And we're going to continue to sharpen, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. I don't know. It's just interesting. I started thinking about it. We can argue about that later. Okay, let's move right along here. All right. So practical considerations. I keep hitting the wrong button. Number one, I'm going to buzz through these really quick. Ask yourself when you get into a conflict situation, what do I really need to say? This is the classic what, where, why, when, how, and who thing, right? But what do I need to say? And what I mean to that is when I'm going to engage a conflict, I want to boil it down to the basics. What is it that's truly important to me in this? Because it's amazing to me when we get fired up in a conflict situation, how many weeds come into the picture. How many things I can, well, it's all about all of this, and my spaghetti brain goes crazy. So I have to ask myself, what really needs to be confronted? What really needs to be the heart of our conversation here? Typically, the other reason I have to ask myself what really needs said here is because good conflict engagement involves more listening than it does talking, right? And that is not, again, when we think about being assertive, we assume that means going at it with our mouths. But sometimes the best conflict resolution comes when we listen long before we speak. And it's funny to me that when I think I know what needs to be said, if I listen long enough, it changes course midstream. Um, so this is everything. When I really assess what needs to be said, I'm talking about the weeds of there's garbage. It's like when I really want to talk about what's bothering me. I just had a conversation last night with a person that was telling me what they were so upset about. And the more I listened, I was like, this is not what they're upset about. This is not at all what they're upset about. And finally, a half an hour later, out of nowhere, she blurts, I ran into somebody today who is in crisis and I can't do anything about it. This is what we're really talking about. So it can be, what do I really need to say? What's the issue we really need to solve here? The other thing is sometimes I'm so bad at this with pleasantries. Like I know I have to engage a hard conversation, but I'm like going to shoot the breeze with you for 35 minutes before we actually get to the heart of the matter. Ashley, this is what we were talking about before, right? We got to have a hard meeting, but we're going to spend the first 35 minutes talking about something just stupid and funny so that everybody will laugh because we think that's going to like butter everybody up for the bad news or the hard thing. It can work, but I am guilty so often of like, let's get to the heart of the matter. We can be kind and pleasant, but we don't have to just spin our wheels over and over until neither of us are listening well because we've been verbally overdrawn, all right? When is the best time to have the conversation? Another important question to ask yourself. This is so true, the old adage that timing is everything, right? What else is happening in if it's in your workplace, what else is going on in the organization? If it's in your family or with a friend, what else besides this isolated conflict is going on with that person? And ask yourself, is this really a good time to bring this up? Early in my marriage, and I'm not proud of this, and I think I've done really good at growing in this, I was the worst at deciding that the best time for Jim and I to engage in a tense situation was as he was picking up his backpack to leave the house for work in the morning. And I was staying home with kids. And I'd be like, oh, this is a good time to have a conversation. Oh my goodness, it was so terrible. Because of course, he didn't have time, he had to be at work, right? And he didn't know what traffic was gonna be like, and this wasn't in Marion. And it was like, okay, this is horrible timing. And so we would just grow in our frustration because he'd think, I can't deal with this right now. I have to be at work. And I'm like, you don't care about me because you're not engaging this conversation. It's like, so think through the timing. It does matter. Another question then is, where should the conversation take place? Sometimes conversations of conflict, believe it or not, demand formal settings. Sometimes they demand informal settings. I learned a long time ago that there are certain people that if I call them into my office, I don't even mean it to be a power move, but it's a power move because that's my space. And so they immediately are on the defensive, right? Because they're in my space. Whereas if I'm willing to go to their space or we're willing to meet in a neutral kind of place, that's a win. It gets us on the right track. Personal story of this, let me finish a few other points. One, sometimes privacy matters. Other times it adds to the intimidation factor. So you have to weigh out, again, what's best for the context of the situation, what's best for the needs of the other person. Location really can determine the ethos of the dialogue that will take place. I think I can admit to you that I have been the instigator of poor conflict management in the past many, many times over. One time where I was the recipient of it was I had been asked to apply for a job. I wasn't seeking a job at the time. So I felt like the Lord gave me a green light, stuck my neck out, went through the whole process, you know what we do with jobs, and I jumped through all the hoops and I did all the paperwork and everything. And then through a series of things that happened, I got asked to meet with the person hiring, and he asked me to meet with him at Starbucks. Okay. Now, honestly, what I thought was going to happen is I was going to go to Starbucks and I was going to get told, well, the process is kind of slow, but we're still working on it. I was like, okay. So I go into Starbucks and I sit down. This conversation was, hey, I know I recruited you for this and was 100% sure you were going to get the job, but actually we decided to go with somebody else. In the middle of Starbucks. And it wasn't like a loud conversation. I don't know that anybody else heard what was going on, but you're sitting there and like, I'm not an overly emotional person, but like I'm tearing up. I'm in the middle of Starbucks. I feel incredible disappointment, embarrassment because I'd let my current employer know I was going to go probably take this other job. It's just horrible choice. And the location really, really mattered. In fact, what I would tell you is as many poor choices as there were in that conflict engagement, the thing I remember the most is that it was in the middle of Starbucks. So location really matters. Where are you having the conversation? Why? Why is it important to have this conversation? This, I think, is a little bit to Tina what you were saying in terms of how do I make sure that what I'm addressing here is what really matters? This goes back a little bit to the what of the conversation, but we need to have clarity on what your desired outcome is for this conversation. Don't engage the conflict or a hard conversation if you don't really know what the hoped for outcome is. And that's not being selfish. You may have to adjust what your hoped for outcome is, right, if we collaborate, but you should at least be clear on what you're trying to accomplish or what you hope is the outcome. Totally crass analogy for you here. When I was in college, I traveled around with a team of people. We traveled something like 12,000 miles in a van together over the course of the summer. And by about 3 or 4 weeks in, I was sick of these people. I'm sure they were sick of me. So I was ranting one night on the phone to my mother, and I was telling her about all these things that the group was doing that was driving me crazy. And she said to me, this is great maternal wisdom. She said, Emily, if someone is picking their nose, it's of no consequence to you. If they're wiping it on you, you have to deal with that. Choose your battles is what she was saying, right? And I really had to stop and say, they're picking their nose, but they're not wiping it on me, so let it go. This is so gross. I'm sorry. But my mother used that, but it's really good. It stuck with me. But choosing your battles, having clarity in the why does this conversation matter in the greater scope of our relationship, that will help you because we can get so, golly, if I had a one-on-one confrontation every time someone did annoyed me, it'd be awful. I'd be like, take me now, Lord. So choose your battles wisely. And then how you go about engaging this conflict conversation is so important. And you know some of these things. Body language, huge. I already told you about my shoulder blade thing. That's something I'm really aware of. Your body language, your conversation style. Again, my tendency to be, haha, let's keep this light. And the other person's thinking this is a big issue. Be aware of the other person's preference in the conversation style that you take. Please hear this. Really think through if you should address the conflict through a text message, through an email. I would venture to say 99% of the time is not a good idea to address conflict electronically. Yet we do it all the time because, again, it's great passive aggressive. See this all the time. I have a great talk with somebody about how they're going to engage a conflict situation. We get all revved up. We're like, yeah, that's the best way. And then they go like, well, I sent an email. There are exceptions to this, of course. And only you can know what that is. But man, is this a default mode in our culture. Eye contact. Man, I get more nervous when somebody's having a conversational conversation with me and they won't look at me. They're looking off into space and they're saying these words, they're looking down at the floor. I'm like, wait a minute, we're human beings. Let's have this conversation, even if it's a difficult one. So being aware of those things. Who should be present? Oh, this is the other one, is we're comfortable. We're like, Heather needs to address something with Abby. And it's tense and it's hard, but she thinks, well, I got a table here of people. It's more safe if I do it in front of all these people. Well, but you just created 5 other conflicts there in the midst of it. So who should be in the room? Be honest about that and make sure that you really know. And then I would say the big one, who, and I gave this one its own slide because I think it's that important. When we ask ourselves the questions, who, first, who am I? That's why this little assessment is a helpful thing. It doesn't mean that's who you're stuck with, but it means this is who I am just in my default mode. So many of us love the Enneagram, so I took this. These are our negative methods, most dominant methods of dealing with conflict based on your Enneagram type. I have a love-hate relationship with this. I feel like the Enneagram so often we just go, well, I'm a 6, so that's just how it is. No, God is forming you, and God can change you. And so if these are our defaults, and I can tell you what, I'm an Enneagram 6, they got it. But I have to work to change that. I have to work to find healthier ways to deal with conflict. So know who you are. And I'm going to go back here. I will, yes. Know who you desire to be, all right? If you're not happy with what I just have up here right now, which I'm not, I don't like this too much, then I'm going to have to be strategic and careful to change the mode in which I operate. And then ask yourself, who am I engaging with? Care enough, if the relationship is worth having a conflict or a hard conversation, then it's worth asking, what do I know about the other person? How would they appreciate that we go about having this conversation? And please know, you will fail time and time again. I feel like I fail people all the time, even when I've done my homework. And I think, oh, I know Andrew. I know what he would prefer when we have this conversation. Then we get in the conversation, it's like, blew it. That isn't what he needed at all. But if I'm mindful of the other person and I'm trying, chances are it's going to go a whole lot better than if I'm not mindful of that at all.